After an incredible Week 1 in which he rushed for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns, it appears that Saquon Barkley could be one of the best performing running backs that the NFL has to offer. However, even if he continues to dominate the league through the 2024 season, it raises the question, just how good is Saquon Barkley actually? To answer this, today we'll take a look at Saquon's football life from his start in high school through his debut with the Philadelphia Eagles. On February 9, 1997, Barkley was born in the Bronx to Alabae Barkley and Tanya Johnson. Saquon comes from a family of athletes. His father was a professional boxer before his career came to an end in a match against Barkley's uncle. Along with this, his brother, Alabae Jr., was a baseball player who went as far as being drafted by the Los Angeles Angels. At around the age of 4 or 5, Saquon and his family left the Bronx and moved to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in hopes of finding a safer place to live. Just 4 years later, the family moved again to Copley, Pennsylvania. Growing up, Barkley followed in his father's footsteps, taking up boxing. However, he also had a deep love for football. In high school, his years of boxing experience would pay off at Whitehall High School. Despite this being one of the top high schools in the entire state of Pennsylvania, the toughness that Saquon learned in the ring molded him into a ferocious rusher who stood out even amongst the top football players in the state. After getting the starting nod at running back in his sophomore season, he did not look back. In his 3 years as the school's starter, he rushed for 3,646 yards and 63 touchdowns. The best season of his high school career came in his senior year, when he ran for 1,856 yards and 36 touchdowns. After proving himself as one of the top running back prospects in the country, Barkley more or less had his pick of what school he went to. ESPN ranked him as a 4-star recruit, the 6th best player in Pennsylvania, the 24th best running back, and the 291st prospect in the entire class. As a result of this, he received offers from some of the top football programs in the country, including Missouri, North Carolina, Notre Dame, and Penn State. Ultimately, Saquon decided to stay close to home and chose to take his talents to Penn State. Despite being a true freshman in the 2015 season, it did not take Barkley long to take over the starting spot at running back. In his debut against Temps, he only received 1 carry for a yard. However, a switch was flipped after this game. From this point on, Barkley turned into a truly elite rusher and never looked back. In Week 2 against Buffalo, on only 12 carries, he picked up 115 yards and a touchdown. His best game of the year came the following week when the Nittany Lions took on Rutgers. Saquon continued to build momentum and exploded for 195 yards and 2 touchdowns on 21 carries. While this was by far his best statistical performance of the year, his showing against Ohio State in Week 7 may take the cake as the most impressive from his freshman year. For some context, Ohio State was the #1 ranked team in the country heading into their matchup against Penn State, and Barkley, as a true freshman, was forced to take the Buckeyes on at home. Despite this, he rose to the occasion and rushed for 194 yards. While he failed to find the end zone and Penn State was trounced by a final score of 38-10, this was still an extremely impressive performance from a true freshman. Saquon finished his freshman year rushing for 1,076 yards and 7 touchdowns, while pulling in 20 passes for 161 yards and a touchdown. Penn State ended their season in a tough 24-17 loss against Georgia in the Tax Slayer Bowl. During his sophomore year, Barkley established himself as one of the top running backs in all of college football. His best game of the season came around the midpoint of the year when Penn State took on Purdue. The Boilermakers had absolutely no hope in slowing down Saquon, and he finished the game with a ridiculous 207 yards and 2 touchdowns in a 62-24 win. Another highlight of his season came in Week 2 against Pittsburgh. Despite Penn State losing the game 42-39 to their in-state rival, Barkley still ended the contest with a jaw-dropping 4 rushing touchdowns. Penn State capped their season off with another bowl game appearance, this time taking on USC in the Rose Bowl. While the offense was playing at an extremely high level, led by Barkley's 194 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground, the defense couldn't do their part and the Nittany Lions fell by a score of 52-49. He finished his sophomore campaign with 1,496 yards and 18 touchdowns on the ground, along with 28 receptions for 402 yards and 4 touchdowns. This earned him the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year award. Heading into his junior year, Barkley entered the season as a consensus All-American. He started the year off on the right foot and lived up to his All-American status. While Penn State took on a much worse opponent in Akron, he still torched their defense for 172 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 14 carries. Despite this, he had a much better performance later in the year when Penn State took on Iowa. Iowa is known for their hard-nosed defense. However, they were no match for Saquon, who could not be stopped, rushing for 211 yards in his score. His final collegiate game took place in a Rose Bowl matchup against Washington. Barkley went out on a high note, rushing for 137 yards and 2 touchdowns in a 35-28 win, the first bowl game win of his career. Saquon finished the season with 1,271 yards and 18 touchdowns on the ground, along with 54 catches for 632 yards and 3 touchdowns. He once again was named the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year and even came close to winning the Heisman. Barkley finished in 4th place in the Heisman voting behind Lamar Jackson, Bryce Love, and Baker Mayfield. Truly having nothing left to prove at the college level and already making it clear that he was the best running back in the 2018 draft class, Barkley forewent his senior season and declared for the draft. Scouts were absolutely in love with Barkley heading into the 2018 NFL Draft, and there was no reason for them not to be. NFL.com gave him a prospect grade of 7.45 out of 8, deeming him a perennial All-Pro. They also gave him a production score of 95 and an athleticism score of 99, for an overall ranking of 98. Ranking first out of all running backs in the draft class in all 3 metrics. After running a 4.4 40-yard dash at the combine, paired with the elite physicality he showed in college, Barkley appeared to be the perfect prospect. In his scouting report of Saquon, NFL analyst Lance Zierlein wrote, "Every down running back with the ability to alter the course of an offense and become a face of the franchise type player." Barkley has the rare ability to create additional yardage through elusiveness, speed, vision, and feel for space in the open field. While he has been tasked with carrying a heavy load at Penn State, their decision to limit his carries somewhat this season could help Barkley headed into his rookie season. Barkley is a buffet runner who thrives with the more plates you give him, and he has a chance to become an early All-Pro no matter which team takes him. In the same scouting report, Zierlein went as far as comparing him to Barry Sanders. With this much hype surrounding Barkley heading into the draft, it made perfect sense that he didn't have to wait long to hear his name called on draft night. After the Cleveland Browns selected Baker Mayfield with the 1st overall pick, the New York Giants with the 2nd pick saw the perfect opportunity to acquire their new franchise running back and took it. The jump to the NFL was no struggle for Saquon, and he proved himself as one of the league's most talented backs in only his rookie season. He finished the year with 1,307 yards and 11 touchdowns on the ground, along with pulling in 91 receptions for 721 yards and 4 touchdowns. This earned him not only the Offensive Rookie of the Year award, but also a spot in the Pro Bowl. While the Giants failed to make the playoffs, it was clear that Barkley had one of the brightest futures in the entire league. The following season, he suffered a high ankle sprain against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers early in the season that caused him to miss some time. Despite this, he was still able to finish the year with a 1,000-yard effort on the ground. He finished his shortened campaign with 1,003 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground, along with 52 receptions for 438 yards and a pair of touchdowns. Injuries continued to haunt Barkley into the 2020 season. Just 2 games into the year, he suffered a torn ACL. This kept him sidelined for the remainder of the year and caused many to believe that the heavy workload that he received at Penn State was beginning to catch up with him. Barkley was far from the same player when he returned from his ACL tear, and this is to be expected. For any running back, especially one that relies on sharp cuts like Saquon, this can be a career-ending injury. He rushed for only 593 yards on 162 carries and found the end zone just twice on the ground. His receiving statistics were not much more promising, pulling in 41 passes for 263 yards. While many counted Barkley out heading into the 2022 season, he had a return to form that almost no one saw coming. He not only played in all 16 regular season games for the Giants, but also posted 1,312 yards and 10 touchdowns on the ground, along with pulling in 57 passes for 338 yards. He made a return to the Pro Bowl this season, along with coming in 3rd place in the Comeback Player of the Year voting, losing out to Christian McCaffrey and Geno Smith. Not only did Barkley have one of the best comebacks in the entire league this season, his efforts also earned the Giants a spot in the playoffs. In his postseason debut in the wildcard round against the Minnesota Vikings, Saquon took over, rushing for 53 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Giants desperately needed these 2 scores, narrowly escaping by a final score of 31-24. In the divisional round, they matched up against the Philadelphia Eagles, who were the top team in the NFC. While they gave it their all, the Giants were far outmatched. Barkley was held to 61 yards and failed to find the end zone, and New York fell by a final score of 38-7. While Barkley took a bit of a step back in the 2023 season, after an incredible Week 1 in which he rushed for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns, it appears that Saquon Barkley could be one of the best performing running backs that the NFL has to offer. However, even if he continues to dominate the league through the 2024 season, it raises the question, just how good is Saquon Barkley actually? To answer this, today we'll take a look at Saquon's football life from his start in high school through his debut with the Philadelphia Eagles. On February 9, 1997, Barkley was born in the Bronx to Alibe Barkley and Tanya Johnson. Saquon comes from a family of athletes. His father was a professional boxer before his career came to an end in a match against one of his uncle. Along with this, his brother, Alibe Jr., was a baseball player and as far as being drafted by the Los Angeles Angels. At around the age of 4 or 5, Saquon and his family left the Bronx and moved to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in hopes of finding a safer place to live. Just 4 years later, the family moved again to Cocoa, Pennsylvania. Growing up, Barkley followed in his father's footsteps, taking up boxing. However, he also had a deep love for football. In high school, his years of boxing experience would pay off at Whitehall High School. Despite this being one of the top high schools in the entire state of Pennsylvania, the toughness that Saquon learned in the ring molded him into a ferocious rusher who stood out even amongst